Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
It is so great to be here to jump into this material with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this deep dive. Usually when you get a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, exactly.
Like, think about engineering or just basic biology. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, yep, there it is. That's the problem.
It's entirely binary, right? I mean, the bone is broken or it isn't. The data is clean, it's visible, and it's undeniable.
And there is this strange comfort in that. We as humans desperately like things to be visible. We like to, categorize our problems.
Oh, absolutely. We want a clear label.
Right. But then you step into the world of society. You look at economics, at moral foundations, at the health of a culture, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Yeah, the picture gets really blurry.
We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. Because you can have a society that looks extraordinarily healthy on the surface. We're talking a booming economy, massive territorial expansion, beautiful architecture, zero unemployment. But underneath the surface, the bones are completely crumbling.
That is such a perfect way to frame it.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into the first half of the Book of Amos. And Amos is essentially a guy who brings a very uncomfortable, highly unauthorized x-ray to a society that was absolutely convinced it was in peak physical condition.
Yeah, the Book of Amos is basically a masterclass in diagnosing systemic hidden rot. It forces us to look at the mechanisms of a society rather than just, the PR campaign.
Right, the glossy brochure.
Exactly. And to truly grasp the explosive power of this text, we really have to start by looking at the incredibly unlikely messenger delivering this diagnosis. Because when you picture an ancient prophet, what usually comes to mind?
I don't know. I guess I tend to imagine these polished royal advisors like people deeply embedded in the king's court.
All right, we picture professional priests who have the ear of monarchy, guys who grew up in the academies of the elite. But Amos, he couldn't be further from that archetype.
He is definitely not wearing the ancient equivalent of a tailored suit.
Not at all. He is a working-class herdsman. He explicitly describes himself as a sheep breeder and a gatherer of wild sycamore fruit.
Wow.
Yeah, and he comes from a rugged, isolated, rural town called Tekoa, which is situated down in the southern kingdom of Judah, right on the edge of a barren wilderness.
So he's really out there.
Or very isolated. This is a man who works with his hands. He understands the dirt, the brutal weather of the Judean desert, the unpredictable nature of livestock.
Wait, I want to pause on the gatherer of wild sycamore fruit detail, because that feels oddly specific. Is there a reason we need to know his day job?
Yeah, it's actually a fascinating detail about his background. The sycamore fig of the ancient Near East wasn't like a sweet, easily plucked fruit. For it to ripen properly and become edible, it had to be manually pierced or bruised by a farmer. It was tedious, sticky, grueling manual labor.
Man, so you really had to work for it.
Exactly. Amos spent his life piercing tough things to make them yield. And the contrast here is just staggering. You have this quiet, calloused, rural background, and yet the message he walks into the northern capital to deliver is explosive.
The text actually introduces his voice as a roaring lion, right?
Yes, literally a roaring lion.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the mission of our deep dive today is to act as thoughtful guides for you, the listener. We want to help you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the real-world application from this ancient text.
Which is so needed right now.
And what is so striking to me is how an ancient herdsman's words speak such absolute volumes about modern inequality, the mechanics of justice, and the profound, insidious dangers of apathy. So let's set the historical stage.
Yeah, context is everything here.
Right. We need to understand the mechanics of the world Amos was walking into. Why was his roar so shocking to them?
Well, to understand the shockwave of his words, we have to look closely at the geopolitical and economic machinery of the 8th century BC. We are talking about a time when the Israelite people were divided into two distinct kingdoms.
Okay, Judah and Israel.
Right. Judah in the south, under King Uzziah, and Israel in the north, under King Jeroboam II. And if you were an ancient economist looking at the northern kingdom of Israel at this moment, you would say they were experiencing a golden age.
So things were going really well for them.
Oh, it was an era of unprecedented economic boom.
Their GDP is practically off the charts, right?
Yeah.
But how exactly were they generating all this wealth? It wasn't just magic.
No, it was a perfect geopolitical storm. The superpower of the region, the Assyrian Empire, was temporarily experiencing internal weakness and had basically pulled back.
Okay, so they backed off.
Exactly. This created a massive power vacuum. King Jeroboam II stepped right into that vacuum. He expanded Israel's territories, and crucially, he took control of the major international trade routes that ran through the Levant, connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia.
Wow, so they controlled the flow of everything.
Israel essentially became the toll booth for the ancient world's most lucrative trade highway. The wealth from tariffs, trade, and military tribute was just pouring into the capital city of Samaria.
So on paper, everything is fantastic. The government is wealthy, the military is strong, the borders are secure.
Yes, but here is where we look at the underlying mechanics, the X-ray you mentioned earlier. How was that wealth actually distributed?
Ah, right. That's always the catch.
Because of this massive influx of international cash, the agrarian society began to shift. It moved away from a system of small, family-owned sustenance farms and rapidly transformed into a cash crop economy driven by massive estates.
Sort of like corporate farming today.
Very much so. The wealthy elites started buying up all the land, often through predatory lending. If a small farmer had a bad harvest, he had to take out a loan from a wealthy landowner at an exorbitant interest rate.
And I'm guessing he usually couldn't pay back.
Exactly. When he couldn't pay it back, the landowner seized the farm and forced the farmer to work it as a debt slave. So underneath this glittering surface of national prosperity, you have systemic corruption, a hijacked judicial system that favored the rich, and a massive, violently widening wealth gap.
And into this exact moment, the text gives us a very specific, chilling time marker. It says, Amos delivered this prophecy 2 years before the earthquake. Now, that is a detail that someone could easily skim right over, but it is actually the key to the whole framework.
Oh, it is massive. Geological and archaeological records, as well as references centuries later by other prophets like Zechariah, confirm that this was a catastrophic, legendary seismic event.
So it was a real historical earthquake?
Absolutely. It left a permanent scar on the cultural memory of the region. But in the context of Amos's message, this literal historic earthquake serves as a looming, terrifying structural metaphor.
Right.
The Creator is giving them a warning period, a 2-year window of grace, before a literal and figurative shaking of their foundations.
I can't help but compare this to a modern economic bubble. Think about the global housing market right before the massive crash in 2008.
That's a really good comparison.
If you looked at the surface, everything looked fantastic. The elites were celebrating, banking executives were throwing massive parties, everyone was talking about how much unprecedented wealth was being generated.
But the math didn't add up.
Exactly. The foundational structure of the market was completely rotten. It was built on bad, predatory loans, on unsustainable exploitation, on a house of cards that mathematically had to fail.
Yes.
And Amos is essentially standing in the ancient equivalent of Wall Street, looking at the ticker tape of their booming economy and saying, I hear the rumble beneath the floorboards. The earthquake is already in motion.
That is the exact mechanism at play. And if we look at the wisdom with discernment here, we need to separate ancient cosmology from enduring structural truth.
What do you mean by that?
Well, ancient audiences often viewed natural disasters purely as direct, targeted, magical, divine retribution. A storm hits, and they assume the gods are angry.
Right, like Zeus throwing a lightning bolt.
Exactly. But the enduring wisdom for us, the principle that translates perfectly to any 21st century civilization, is about the inevitable collapse of any society built on unsustainable exploitation.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
If your foundation relies on crushing the vulnerable, the resulting earthquake, whether it's an economic depression, a social revolution, or institutional collapse, isn't just an arbitrary punishment dropping from the sky. It is the natural, structural, mathematically inevitable result of a rotten foundation.
You cannot build a heavy stone tower on a base of sand and then act surprised when it falls over.
Precisely.
But here is the logistical problem Amos faces. If you just walk off your sheep farm, hike into a wealthy, powerful, highly insulated capital city and start screaming that they are all structurally rotten and about to collapse, they're going to throw you out.
Oh, without a doubt.
Or worse, execute you on the spot. They aren't going to listen to a southern peasant.
Which is exactly why Amos doesn't do that. He employs one of the most masterful, psychologically brilliant rhetorical traps in all of ancient literature.
I love this part.
He doesn't start by attacking his wealthy northern audience directly. He sets up his soapbox in Bethel, which is the religious and cultural center of the north, and he starts pointing his finger outward at their enemies.
It's so smart.
He draws the listeners in with this brilliant, captivating bait and switch.
Oh, the geography of this rhetorical trap is just so fascinating. You can just imagine the scene. He's standing in the market square, the wealthy elites are walking by, and he starts calling out the surrounding nations, one by one.
And they're eating it up.
Oh, the Israelites are probably stopping, listening, and cheering him on.
Yeah.
Because who doesn't love hearing that their political enemies are going to face justice?
It's the oldest political trick in the book. Rally the crowd by attacking the outgroup. He starts by pointing northeast to Syria, their bitter military rival. He says Damascus is going to be judged for threshing Gilead with threshing instruments of iron.
Which sounds poetic, but what does it actually mean in terms of mechanics? Like, what is a threshing instrument here?
It refers to horrific war crimes. A threshing sled was a heavy wooden board embedded with sharp iron spikes or stones, normally dragged by oxen over harvested wheat to separate the grain.
Oh, wow.
Amos is saying the Syrian army literally dragged these heavy, spiked agricultural machines over the bodies of the prisoners of war in the region of Gilead. It was a terror tactic to ensure the populace would never rebel again.
That is absolute brutality, and the crowd in Israel is likely screaming, yes, burn Damascus to the ground.
Exactly. Then Amos pivots and points southwest toward Philistia, down in Gaza. He calls them out for human trafficking.
Okay.
He says they carried away captive whole communities to deliver them up to Edom. Now, the mechanics here are crucial. This wasn't taking prisoners of war.
So it wasn't just typical ancient warfare.
No, this was the systematic kidnapping of entire peaceful civilian populations for the sole purpose of selling them wholesale into the ancient Mediterranean slave market to fuel Edomite mining operations. It was the prioritization of pure economic gain over basic human autonomy.
So he's hitting war crimes, he's hitting systemic human trafficking. What's next?
He moves up the coast to Tyre, a wealthy Phoenician city-state. He condemns them for also participating in this massive slave trade, but adds a specific layer. They broke a brotherly covenant.
What does that mean in this context?
They violated diplomatic treaties and betrayed their allies just to make a profit in the slave market. Trust and international law meant nothing compared to revenue.
The crowd is probably hanging on his every word by now. They're loving this.
It only escalates. He looks southeast to Edom. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob, so they shared a deep ancestral lineage with Israel.
Right, they were literally cousins.
But Amos calls Edom out for unrelenting generational anger. He says they pursued their brother with the sword, cast off all pity, and kept their wrath forever.
That is the psychology of grudges that just won't die. The refusal to break the cycle of generational violence?
Yes. And from there, he points directly east to Ammon. And the crime he lists here is viscerally horrific. He says the Ammonites ripped open pregnant women in the territory of Gilead. But notice the why. Amos explicitly states the motive that they might enlarge their border.
That is the crucial detail. This wasn't just random, chaotic wartime violence. It was a calculated demographic strategy.
Exactly.
If you eradicate the next generation, you permanently clear the land of its future inhabitants, making it much easier to annex the territory. It is pure, unadulterated, violent greed for real estate, masquerading as military strategy.
It's ethnic cleansing for border expansion. And finally, he completes the circle by calling out Moab to the southeast, condemning them for desecrating the bones of an enemy king, the king of Edom, burning them into lime.
So they wouldn't even let the dead rest.
No, they took their hatred beyond the grave, refusing even the basic dignity of rest for the dead.
Now, I have to pause the narrative here, because there is a massive obstacle to growth for the modern listener. When you read these first two chapters, the sheer scale of the brutality is staggering.
It really is.
And Amos repeatedly says that the Creator is going to send literal fire to devour the palaces of these nations. It sounds like this terrifying, fiery wrath. For someone today listening to this on their commute, it can feel very distant, very ancient, and frankly, like the violent tribalism we are trying to evolve past.
I understand that friction entirely. It is harsh language. But what's fascinating here is the profound, world-altering theological shift that Amos is introducing to human history.
How so?
You have to understand the ancient Near Eastern mindset. In that era, gods were strictly territorial. The god of Moab only cared about Moab's borders and Moab's people. The god of the Philistines only cared about Philistia.
Right.
If Moab attacked Ammon, the god of Israel wouldn't care because it didn't happen on his turf.
It was essentially a localized jurisdiction, like a governor only caring about their own state.
Exactly. But Amos steps into the square and portrays a god of universal justice. He is making the radical claim that the creator of the universe holds all nations accountable to a baseline standard of human rights, regardless of whether those nations worship him and regardless of whose borders the atrocities happen within.
That is a massive paradigm shift.
He is saying there is an objective moral fabric to the universe, and when you rip open a pregnant woman to steal a piece of dirt, you are offending the creator of life itself. This was intellectually revolutionary.
So translating this to the 21st century, we are looking at the foundational concept of universal human dignity. We're talking about crimes against humanity.
Yes.
Aggressive border expansions where civilian lives mean nothing, the trafficking of vulnerable people, the breaking of international treaties, the generational cycles of ethnic hatred. These aren't just local political disputes to be argued about on cable news. They are universal wrongs.
And importantly, for you listening to this deep dive right now, whether your political leanings are on the left or the right, whether you live in the global north or the global south, Amos forces us to maintain strict impartiality.
Which is so hard for people to do.
Very hard. A human rights abuse is an abuse, no matter whose flag is flying over the palace. The standard of human dignity is not tethered to a specific nation's borders, their GDP, or their political ideology.
So the Israelite crowd in Bethel is hearing this universal standard applied to all their enemies, and they are undoubtedly cheering. They're entirely on Amos's side. The trap is perfectly set.
And then the trap snaps shut. After getting them completely aligned with his outrage, Amos suddenly turns the spotlight squarely onto them.
Oh, man.
He says, "For 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment."
The ultimate plot twist. The crowd must have gone dead silent. They thought they were the audience watching the trial. Suddenly, they realized they are the ones in the defendant's chair.
It's brilliant. But notice how Amos pivots the charges. The specific crimes he lists for Israel are entirely different from the brutal, bloody war crimes of their neighbors.
Right, he doesn't mention threshing sleds here.
No. He doesn't accuse Israel of ripping open pregnant women or dragging threshing sleds over prisoners. He attacks their economic and social machinery. He says, they sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes.
Let's break down the mechanics of that phrase because it is so loaded. Selling the poor for a pair of shoes. Is he speaking metaphorically about how little they value them?
He is speaking quite literally about the ancient debt courts. In their society, the judicial system had been entirely corrupted by wealth. The righteous in this context refers to the innocent person in a legal dispute.
Okay, so the guy who is actually in the right.
Exactly. If a wealthy person wanted a poor farmer's land, they would take him to court on a fabricated charge. The wealthy man would slip a small bribe, a few pieces of silver, to the judge. The judge would rule against the innocent farmer, plunging him into debt.
And I'm guessing the farmer can't pay the fine.
Right. And when the farmer couldn't pay, the law allowed the creditor to take the farmer and his family as slaves.
Just to cover the cost of a fabricated debt. That is insane.
Exactly. And the pair of shoes or sandals represents the most trivial, minor debt imaginable. They were literally enslaving human beings, permanently stripping families of their freedom over debts as small as the cost of cheap footwear.
That is just terrifying.
It expresses absolute chilling contempt for human life. The rich are trading the fundamental dignity of the poor for the most trivial consumer goods.
I cannot help but draw a direct analogy here to the modern fast fashion industry, or global sweatshop labor, or the cobalt mines in our tech supply chains.
Oh, that is exactly the right parallel to make.
When we as modern consumers demand a t-shirt that costs less than a cup of coffee, or we demand the newest smartphone at the cheapest possible price, we are prioritizing trivial, cheap consumer goods over the basic humanity, safety, and living wages of the people producing them across the globe. Aren't we doing exactly what Amos is condemning? We are implicitly trading the health and well-being of the invisible poor for a pair of shoes.
That is the exact modern parallel. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Amos is pointing out a complete systemic failure of empathy. He uses this highly poetic, devastating phrase. He says they pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor.
What does that even mean, panting after dust?
In the ancient Near East, when someone was in deep mourning or absolute despair, they would literally throw dust or ashes on their own heads.
Okay, as a sign of grief.
Right. Amos is saying the wealthy elites are so pathologically greedy, they want to monetize the very dirt that the grieving poor throw on their own heads. There is nothing left to take from these people, and the rich still want more.
Wow.
They turn aside the way of the meek, they pervert justice, and this rot doesn't just stay in the courtroom, it bleeds into the darkest corners of their private lives. Amos calls out severe sexual immorality, specifically mentioning a form of incest or familial sexual abuse, where a man and his father are exploiting the exact same young, vulnerable female servant. It is the absolute desecration of human bodies and the profaning of any concept of holiness.
And what's terrifying is how the society protects this corruption. Amos says they force the Nazarites to drink wine, and they command the prophets not to prophesy. Let's explain the mechanics of this, because the psychology here is so relevant to how modern institutions function.
Absolutely.
Who were the Nazarites?
A Nazarite was an individual in ancient Israel who took a special voluntary vow of intense dedication to the Creator. Part of this strict vow was a commitment to never consume alcohol or any product of the grapevine.
So they were basically the visible moral exemplars of the community.
They were the ones holding the ethical baseline.
Right. And a deeply corrupt society cannot handle the presence of an ethical baseline.
Exactly. When a culture is steeped in exploitation and rot, seeing someone live a disciplined, highly ethical life is like holding up a massive mirror that reflects everyone else's guilt. The very existence of the Nazarite makes the corrupt elite deeply uncomfortable.
It makes them feel bad about themselves.
So what do? Instead of changing their own behavior, they actively try to corrupt the ethical person. They literally force the Nazarites to break their vows, to drink wine, dragging them down into the mud so no one has to feel convicted anymore. And at the same time, they silence the prophets who dare to speak the truth.
It is the exact psychological equivalent of a toxic workplace.
Yeah.
Imagine a corporate environment where everyone is quietly skimming money from the budget or padding their expense reports.
That happens all the time.
If a new employee comes in and refuses to steal, their absolute honesty makes everyone else feel like a criminal.
Yeah.
So the group pressure turns entirely on that one honest person. They mock them, they threaten them, they force them to compromise, just so everyone is complicit and the cognitive dissonance goes away.
Yeah, that is a great analogy.
Silencing the prophets is like a corrupt corporation firing the whistleblower to protect the stock price. It's the active normalization of corruption.
That is a perfect structural analogy, and it leads us to a highly practical reflection.
Yes, for you listening, here is a practical how-to, a question you can use to audit your own life. Where do we trade human dignity for convenience? How can you look at your own daily habits, your investments, the supply chains of the things you buy, and ensure your comforts aren't built on someone else's exploitation?
It's a tough mirror to look into.
When you are in an environment where ethical corners are being cut, do you hold your ground or do you drink the wine they force on you just to blend in?
It is a profoundly uncomfortable question, and the Israelites in Amos's audience had a built-in defense mechanism to avoid asking it. They believed they held a cosmic insurance policy. And that brings us to chapter 3, where Amos dismantles their views on privilege, accountability, and the inescapable snare of the lion.
Oh, this defense is so common. Having just had all their systemic crimes exposed in front of the crowd, the Israelites lean back on their theology. They are thinking, wait a minute, we are the chosen people. The Creator made a special covenant with our ancestors. He brought us out of Egypt. We have special status, which means we are immune to these consequences.
And Amos shatters that illusion with what is arguably the most revolutionary single sentence in the text. Speaking on behalf of the Creator, he says, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities."
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because it takes the entire human concept of privilege and turns it completely upside down.
It radically redefines it. The human default is to assume that privilege means immunity. If I have a special relationship with the boss, I can show up late to work and not get fired.
Right, you get a pass.
The Israelites thought, God loves us most, so he will overlook our corruption. Amos says the exact opposite. Privilege means ultimate responsibility. The closer you are to the truth, the more moral light you have been given, and the higher your status, the higher your standard of accountability.
That makes total sense.
The Creator is essentially saying, because I have favored you, because I gave you the blueprint for a just society, I absolutely will not let you get away with building an empire of exploitation.
To drive this unavoidable reality home, Amos launches into this rapid-fire series of rhetorical questions to illustrate the unbreakable laws of cause and effect. He asks, Can two walk together except they be agreed?
Right.
Meaning, you can't claim to be walking with the creator of justice if your feet are running toward systemic theft. Then he shifts to these vivid, terrifying nature metaphors. Will a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? Get a bird fall in a snare upon the earth where no gin or trap is set for him?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Amos is acting like a moral physicist explaining the laws of gravity. Actions have inevitable consequences. In the wild, a lion stalking its prey is completely silent. It only roars after it has pounced and locked its jaws onto the victim. So if you hear the lion roar, it means the strike has already happened. The doom is certain.
Oh, wow.
If a bird trap snaps shut, it's because a bird landed on the trigger mechanism. Amos is telling them that God's warnings through the prophets are not just empty, angry threats meant to scare people into behaving. They are the natural, inevitable result of a society that has triggered the trap of its own destruction.
You reap what you sow.
Exactly. When a society rots its own foundations through injustice, the collapse isn't some random accident or bad luck. It's the trap snapping shut.
And the imagery Amos uses for the aftermath of this collapse is just haunting. He wants to disabuse them of the idea that they are going to ride this out smoothly. He describes what survival looked like using this visceral metaphor of a shepherd pulling two legs or a piece of an ear out of a lion's mouth. I mean, it is horrifying.
It is incredibly graphic, and it is rooted in ancient agricultural law. If a lion killed a sheep from a flock, the shepherd was legally required to retrieve whatever pieces of the carcass remained, a leg, a piece of an ear, and bring it back to the owner, to prove that the animal was taken by a predator and not stolen and sold by the shepherd himself.
So Amos is using this legal imagery to say what, yes, Israel, you will survive.
But you will survive as a mutilated fragment. He is saying, yes, a remnant of you will make it through this coming earthquake, this coming invasion, but it will be incredibly narrow and it will be deeply, generationally traumatic. You won't be escaping whole. You will be pulled from the jaws of history as a bleeding fragment.
What about all the wealth they accumulated? All the things they sold the poor to get? Amos specifically targets their luxury real estate. He says the winter house and the summer house of ivory will be totally demolished.
Yep.
The great houses will have an end. The very places where they sought refuge, the physical symbols of their insulated inequality will be the first things targeted and crushed.
Which is the perfect narrative bridge. Amos moves from condemning the broad societal structures to focusing like a laser beam on the specific individuals hiding inside those ivory summer houses, the ultra-wealthy elite who are driving the demand for this inequality. And this is where we encounter the famous and highly controversial metaphor of the kine of Bashan.
Let's set the scene. Amos points his finger at the wealthy elite of Samaria. The text specifically addresses the women, though the linguistic structure heavily implicates the husbands and male leaders who fund them as well.
Right.
And he calls them kine, which is an old word for cows of Bashan. Bashan was a region east of the Sea of Galilee, famous for its incredibly rich, lush, fertile pastures. So the cows raised there were the fattest, most pampered, most highly prized livestock in the ancient world.
Very pampered.
He says, "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, that are in the mountain of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, bring and let us drink."
Now, we must address an immediate obstacle to growth here. For a modern listener, especially in today's cultural climate, calling a group of women cows sounds incredibly abrasive, offensive, and blatantly misogynistic. It is a jarring, harsh metaphor that makes us instinctively recoil.
I have to push back on Amos here. If a speaker got on a stage in Silicon Valley or Wall Street today, looked at the wealthy elite in the audience, and called them pampered cows, they would be dragged off the stage and canceled before they finished the sentence.
Oh, absolutely.
What is he possibly trying to achieve with language that hostile? Is he just hate wealth? Am I the villain if I work hard and buy a comfortable couch?
That is the exact friction Amos wants you to feel. It is not about the couch itself. He isn't condemning the existence of wealth. He is attacking the blindness it creates. We have to understand the prophetic intent behind the shock value.
Yeah, so it's a tactic.
Yes. Amos is intentionally using a jarring, grotesque metaphor to pierce through an incredibly thick, impenetrable psychological bubble of privilege. These people are entirely insulated from the blood and sweat required to maintain their lifestyle.
So the true ugliness he is pointing out isn't their physical appearance. It is the hideousness of their apathy.
Precisely. Notice the mechanics of their crime. Amos says they oppress the poor and crush the needy, but are these wealthy elites literally out in the streets physically beating the poor with sticks?
Probably not.
No, their hands are perfectly manicured. They are lounging in absolute luxury, demanding of their stewards and husbands, bring, let us drink. They just want the endless flow of fine wine and exotic foods. But they are entirely willfully reckless about how those luxuries are procured.
They don't care where it comes from.
Right. They don't care that their endless demand for cheaper, better, faster luxuries requires the systemic crushing of the agrarian class to fund it.
It is willful supply chain blindness. It reminds me of the ancient legal proverb, he who does a thing through another does it himself.
That's a great proverb.
They might not see the tears of the oppressed. They might never visit the debt courts or the sweatshops, but they are drinking the wine bought with those tears. The blood is on their ledgers. And because they were so completely insulated in their ivory houses, Amos reveals that the Creator set them a series of escalating systemic wake-up calls to try to break through their numbness.
Amos lists them out chronologically. He shows how the Creator used the natural world and macroeconomics to signal that their foundation was failing. First, he says God sent widespread famine, which he poetically calls cleanness of teeth in all their cities, a total lack of food.
But they just wrote it out, relying on their wealth, and didn't change their system.
Exactly.
So the famine didn't work. What next?
Targeted droughts. Amos describes a bizarre meteorological phenomenon where it would rain on one city, but the neighboring city would be completely dry. The water table was failing. People were wandering like exhausted beggars from city to city just to find drinking water.
That sounds like a climate crisis.
It really does. But they still ignored the warning. Then came agricultural blight. He sent palmer worms and locusts to devour their meticulously manicured gardens and vineyards. When that failed, he sent pestilence, massive disease outbreaks, and finally, the ultimate human disaster war. Military defeats so severe that the stench of the dead in their own camps rose up into their nostrils.
And after every single one of these catastrophic systemic failures, Amos repeats this haunting, tragic refrain. 5 separate times he says, "Yet have you not returned unto me."
It is a devastating psychological portrait of stubbornness. The Creator is utilizing every lever of reality ecology, economics, geopolitics, public health to signal to the society that they are on a path of self-destruction.
Just shaking them to wake up.
He is desperately trying to break through their numbness, but they absolutely refuse to course correct. They just view these disasters as temporary inconveniences to be managed rather than profound moral warnings to be heeded.
Think about the modern translation of this. How often does our society ignore massive flashing warning signs on the dashboard of our civilization?
All the time.
We see unprecedented environmental degradation. We experience massive, cascading economic instability. We witness social unrest and the fraying of our local communities. We endure global health crises. And yet, we stubbornly refuse to fundamentally change course.
It's true.
We just apply a technological patch to the symptom, print some more money, and go right back to our comfortable habits. Yet have you not returned? It is chilling how human nature hasn't moved an inch.
This raises a terrifying question. What happens when a society burns through all of its warning signs? What happens when the final alarm is ignored? And Amos gives the answer. After listing all these specific localized disasters, the tone of the text shifts ominously.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean terrifying. Amos stops listing plagues. He issues the ultimate, unspecified ultimatum. He says, "Therefore thus will I do unto thee, O Israel, and because I will do this unto thee, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel." It literally gives me chills.
It absolutely should. It's the end of a line. It's not a call to another religious festival. It's a subpoena. It's an invitation to a final, inescapable reckoning.
Wow.
The Creator of the mountains, the wind, the one who declares to man what his secret thoughts are, is stepping into the courtroom. The time for warnings is over.
But wait, I could hear the Israelites mounting their final defense here. And it's a defense that leads us directly into chapter 5. The elites are probably standing there thinking, hold on, Amos, you're calling us wicked. You're saying God is against us. We are incredibly religious.
Yep, that's exactly what they would say.
We go to the temple at Bethel every week. We offer massive, expensive sacrifices. We fund the choirs. If they were so inherently rotten, how do we explain their massive religious devotion?
They were extremely religious, and that, Amos reveals, was the very core of the problem. Their religion wasn't a catalyst for moral transformation. It was a mask.
It was a cover-up.
It was an elaborate mechanism to cover their corruption. And this leads us to the core wisdom of chapter 5, which contains arguably the most powerful, enduring passages in the entire prophetic tradition. The absolute prioritization of justice over ritual.
Amos stands there and delivers the Creator's verdict on their lavish religious services. And it is utterly brutal. Speaking for God, he says, I despise your feast days, and I will not smell in your solemn assemblies.
Yeah, he does not hold back.
Though ye offer me burnt offerings, I will not accept them. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols.
Think about how deeply offensive that would be to hear. They have hired the best choirs. They have composed the most elaborate liturgy. They are burning the finest incense and sacrificing the most expensive livestock at the major shrines in Bethel and Gilgal.
So they're spending a lot of money on this.
Vast fortunes on their public worship. But the Creator says he finds it physically repulsive. The smell of their incense makes him want to vomit. The sound of their beautiful harp music is just a chaotic, irritating noise to him.
Why, though? Just because of the hypocrisy?
Because these beautiful songs and massive tithes are structurally paired with the active oppression of the poor. While they're singing hymns, their lawyers are taking bribes at the city gates, turning away the needy, and their merchants are using rigged scales to steal wheat from the desperate.
It is virtue signaling in its most ancient, purest form. They are putting on a massive, highly visible public display of piety. They are essentially trying to bribe the Creator with expensive rituals so they can soothe their own consciences and go right back to exploiting their workers on Monday morning.
And the Creator's response is, I cannot be bribed. The climax of the entire book, the central beating heart of Amos's thesis, comes right here. He says, but let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream.
Let's really look at the mechanics of that metaphor. A mighty stream, it sounds lovely, like a gentle brook babbling through a meadow.
But that completely misses the geographical reality Amos is drawing from. In the arid landscape of the ancient Near East, a mighty stream often refers to a wadi.
What is a wadi?
A wadi is a dry, dusty riverbed in the desert. For months, it does absolutely nothing. But when the rains finally hit the mountains, the water funnels into that wadi and creates a massive, violent flash flood.
Oh, wow.
It is an unstoppable wall of water that completely alters the landscape. It tears away to dead wood, it carves new paths through solid rock, it sweeps away everything artificial in its path.
So it's not peaceful at all.
Not at all. Amos is saying that
true spirituality, true enlightenment, is inextricably linked to social justice. You cannot separate how you treat the Creator from how you treat the Creator's creations. It's intellectually impossible.
Exactly. There is an old philosophical idea that dissembled piety is double iniquity, meaning faking righteousness is twice as evil as just being openly bad, because you are using the tools of goodness to camouflage your rot.
That is so true.
It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. We often use rituals, whether they are religious services or modern secular equivalents, to soothe our conscience while remaining deeply complicit in unjust systems.
Wait, secular equivalents, like what?
Like posting the socially mandated hashtag during a crisis, or buying the $80 t-shirt from the brand that claims to be ethical, or putting the right bumper sticker on your car.
Oh, wow, yeah, that is close to home.
We perform these highly visible, low-cost rituals to signal to our tribe that we are the good guys, which temporarily relieves our guilt about participating in an economy that crushes the vulnerable. We sing our modern songs, but we refuse to let justice actually alter our bank accounts or our daily conveniences.
So here is the practical how-to for you listening today. And it is a deeply uncomfortable question to ask yourself. Are my public displays of morality or religion or social awareness actually aligned with how I treat the least powerful people in my private life?
That is the big question.
When I interact with a frustrated customer service rep on the phone, or a subordinate at work who makes a mistake, or the invisible person delivering my groceries in the rain, does my righteousness flow like an unstoppable, life-giving stream? Or does my empathy dry up the exact moment it costs me time, money, or convenience?
That is the perfect piercing application of Chapter 5, and it leads us directly into the final section of our deep dive today, covering the end of Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, which deals with the profound danger of apathy and a massive theological misconception about something called the Day of the Lord.
Right, because underneath their religious rituals, the Israelites held onto a specific, highly optimistic theology. They were actively waiting for the day of the Lord.
They really were.
In their minds, this meant a future moment when the Creator was going to dramatically intervene in history, destroy all of Israel's geopolitical enemies, and usher in a golden era of permanent prosperity and peace for them. They were excited for it to arrive.
And Amos completely flips this theology on its head. He says, "Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light."
He uses this brilliantly dark, almost darkly conic psychological imagery to explain it. He says, waiting for the day of the Lord will be as if a man fled from a lion, only to run right into a bear. Or the man escapes the bear, makes it all the way home exhausted, leans his hand against the wall of his own safe living room, and a poisonous snake bites him.
What's fascinating here is the psychological insight into false security. Think about the man in the metaphor. He thinks he has escaped. He thinks he is completely safe because he made it inside the walls of his own house.
He's finally relaxed.
But the fatal threat is already inside the walls with him. Amos is telling the Israelites there is absolutely no escaping moral accountability. You cannot outrun the consequences of systemic injustice. If you manage to avoid the lion of a foreign military invasion, the bear of internal economic collapse will get you.
If you avoid the bear.
And if you somehow survive the bear, the snake of deep internal moral decay will bite you right in the comfort of your own living room. The rot is inside the house.
And who exactly is leaning on that wall? Who is lounging in that safe living room? In chapter 6, Amos zeroes in on them again. He says, woe to them that are at ease in Zion and trust in the mountain of Samaria.
He's looking right at the rich.
He paints this vivid cinematic picture of the elites. They are lounging on beds made of solid imported ivory. They're eating the absolute finest meats tender lambs right out of the flock, pampered calves from the stall.
Yeah, the best of everything.
They're inventing new, elaborate musical instruments, arrogantly comparing their artistic genius to King David. And they aren't just sipping a civilized glass of wine. They are drinking wine by the massive bowlful, getting completely obliterated, and anointing themselves with the most expensive imported perfumes to mask the literal stench of a decaying society around them.
It is the absolute pinnacle of sensory indulgence and insulation. They are bathing in the delights of the senses, gorging themselves, and they care nothing for how the rest of the world goes.
It's disgusting.
But then comes the ultimate indictment, the final crushing hammer blow from Amos. After listing all their magnificent luxuries, he states their true underlying crime. But they are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph.
Wow. We have to explain that because Joseph is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Yeah.
Joseph represents the vulnerable brother. If we look back at the historical story from the book of Genesis, Joseph's brothers are jealous of him. They strip him, beat him, and throw him into a dark, empty pit in the desert. And what is the very next thing the brothers do while he is screaming for help? They sit down to eat a comfortable meal together.
Yes, the psychological disconnect is chilling. They are peacefully feasting while their own brother is dying in a pit just a few yards away. The elites of Amos's day are doing the exact same thing on a macroeconomic scale.
That is so dark.
They have anesthetized themselves with ivory beds, veal, and bowls of wine, while their own nation, their vulnerable brothers and sisters, are breaking apart under the weight of debt and corruption. They are entirely, terrifyingly numb.
If we translate this to modern times, it perfectly describes the danger of the doom scroll, combined with frictionless delivery apps. We have the unprecedented technological ability to surround ourselves with absolute, unbroken comfort.
We really do.
We can have any cuisine on earth delivered to our door in 30 minutes. We can stream endless high-definition entertainment on our screens. We can perfectly climate control our environments, and we can do all of this while endlessly scrolling through horrific tragedies on our phones, remaining entirely numb and apathetic to the suffering happening right outside our doors, or the suffering embedded in the global supply chains that bring us these magical comforts. We are eating the meal while our brother is in the pit.
Apathy is the ultimate target of Amos's roar. The core problem wasn't merely that the elites had money, it was that their wealth had functioned as an anesthetic. It had blinded their eyes, deafened their ears, and paralyzed their capacity for empathy.
We were not grieved.
When a society loses its capacity for collective grief over the suffering of its most vulnerable members, the earthquake is already happening. The foundations are already gone. The snake is already in the wall.
So what does this all mean for us today? As we summarize the core wisdom of our journey through these incredibly dense chapters of Amos, it comes down to a few inescapable truths. True wisdom requires us to aggressively look past the borders of our own comfort.
Yes, it does.
It demands that we do the hard work of recognizing our complicity in massive systemic issues. And it insists, with absolute authority, that our outward virtues, our rituals, our hashtags, and our public faces must perfectly match our internal ethics and our private actions toward the vulnerable.
Amos leaves us with the profound realization that privilege is never a shield against accountability. It is the very mechanism that increases our responsibility to others. And justice cannot just be a polite trickle of occasional charity. It must be a mighty disruptive stream that sweeps through and cleanses every facet of our lives, our businesses, and our communities.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Imagine if a modern-day Amos, a calloused worker from the bottom of the supply chain, were to stand in the glittering financial capitals of our world today.
Just picture that for a second.
Imagine him walking into Wall Street, or the city of London, or Tokyo, or a keynote stage in Silicon Valley. If he were to look with that precise, uncomfortable X-ray at our global supply chains, our staggering historical wealth gaps, our digital algorithms that literally monetize outrage and depression, and our relentless disregard for the environmental foundation of our planet, what songs of ours would he say the Creator is physically refusing to listen to?
That is a chilling thought.
What modern rituals are we performing to make ourselves feel like the good guys while the affliction of Joseph continues uninterrupted in our streets and our factories?
It is a question that requires immense courage just to ask, and even more courage to actually answer with our lives.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.